You might be wondering, or even feeling a bit apprehensive, about taking exposure work into real-life situations. But what if practicing in those situations could help you both tolerate the anxiety and strengthen the skills you need so they're available when you need them the most? Welcome back to Quieting Anxiety, a podcast by Excel at Life. I'm Dr. Monica Frank, and in today's episode, we're going to look more closely at what happens when you move from imagining feared situations to actually facing them in the real world. We'll talk about two related approaches: general in vivo exposure and in vivo coping exposure. Let's begin by settling into this moment. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently. Allow your shoulders to soften just a little more each time you exhale. You don't have to face anything right now. You're simply preparing, learning how to approach situations that bring anxiety with more clarity and more choice. Take one more breath and bring that sense of readiness with you as we begin. Both general in vivo exposures and in vivo coping exposures are forms of real-life exposure. In fact, in vivo is a Latin expression meaning something occurring in real life. In vivo exposures build on the gradual desensitization method you've been learning, using a hierarchy, starting at manageable levels, and progressing step by step. But they differ in their focus and in how you work with anxiety while you're in the situation. And just a quick reminder before we start, the exposure methods can be quite intense, which means if done wrong, they can worsen anxiety instead of help. So be sure you have therapeutic guidance before attempting. A general in vivo exposure is what many people think of when they hear the term exposure therapy. The goal is to enter a feared situation and remain there long enough for the anxiety to rise, peak, and then gradually settle on its own. You are allowing your nervous system to learn through direct experience that you can stay in the situation and that the anxiety will not keep increasing forever. Over time, this repeated experience builds tolerance. Your brain learns that the situation is uncomfortable, but not dangerous, and that escape is not necessary. An in vivo coping exposure also involves facing the feared situation in real life, but the emphasis shifts slightly. Instead of focusing primarily on staying until the anxiety dissipates, the focus is on practicing how you will cope while you're in the situation. You are deliberately walking through the experience while following a plan for managing anxious thoughts and physical symptoms. The exposure becomes a structured opportunity to rehearse coping skills, so they become more automatic and accessible when anxiety arises unexpectedly. Both approaches rely on the same gradual desensitization principles. You begin by identifying a goal, something you want to be able to do with less avoidance. Then you build a hierarchy of steps leading to that goal, ranking each step according to how much anxiety you expect it to provoke. You start at a manageable level, often somewhere in the middle of that scale, and repeat the exposure until your anxiety becomes more tolerable. Whether you're doing a general in vivo exposure or a coping-focused one, you are still working your way up that hierarchy gradually. You are still using your anxiety rating scale to guide decisions about when to repeat a step and when to move forward. The structure remains the same. What changes is the intention during the exposure itself. In a general in vivo exposure, your primary task is to stay. You allow the anxiety to be there without trying to force it away. You may use basic grounding or breathing if needed, but the emphasis is on letting your nervous system adjust naturally. For example, if someone fears going into a crowded store, a general in vivo exposure might involve entering the store, remaining there, and noticing the rise and fall of anxiety without leaving prematurely. The success lies in staying long enough for the anxiety to shift on its own. In an in vivo coping exposure, you will stay, but you are also actively practicing specific coping responses. This can be especially helpful when you need to function within the situation rather than simply endure it. If you're giving a presentation at work and feel anxious about public speaking, you can't step out of the room and wait for the anxiety to subside. You need strategies to help you remain engaged. In that case, the exposure includes deliberately using coping tools, slowing your breathing while speaking, pausing for a sip of water to gather your thoughts, using calming self-talk, or grounding your attention on the material you're presenting. The goal is not just to tolerate the anxiety, but to practice responding to it effectively while continuing to participate. You may have had the experience of thinking, I was doing well in therapy, but when something caught me off guard, I didn't remember any of my skills. That's very common. It isn't a failure. It simply means your brain needs more practice using those skills while you're actually feeling anxious. Knowing what to do is one thing. Being able to do it in the moment is another. This is where in vivo coping exposure becomes especially useful. It helps bridge the gap between learning a coping skill and being able to use it under pressure. Instead of only tolerating the anxiety, you deliberately practice responding to it with intention, using calming self-talk, grounding, breathing, or whatever tools you've been developing. Over time, that pairing between anxiety and skillful response becomes stronger, and your brain begins to access those tools more automatically. Imagine someone working through a hierarchy for driving anxiety. They might start by driving to the corner and back, then around the block, then to a nearby store. In a traditional exposure, the focus would be on completing each step and staying long enough for the anxiety to settle. In a coping exposure, there's an added layer of structure. Before getting in the car, they review their coping plan. During the drive, they practice supportive self-talk, such as, I can handle this, I'm okay. If anxiety rises, they use grounding strategies, naming what they see, hear, or feel. The goal isn't only to reduce anxiety, it's to strengthen the ability to respond to anxiety effectively, so that those responses carry over into situations that are less predictable. Repetition is what makes this work. Each time you deliberately pair an anxious situation with coping strategies, you're training your brain to respond with steadiness instead of panic. The exposure itself becomes the setting for rehearsal. Over time, those coping responses begin to feel more natural. And when anxiety appears unexpectedly, you're more likely to remember what to do because you've practiced doing it while anxious, not just when calm. This approach is also more intentional than simply going through situations that already make you anxious. You might be thinking, but I face this situation all the time and I'm still anxious. That may be true. But if you're moving through those situations without consciously practicing your coping tools, your brain is only rehearsing the fear. A coping exposure changes that. It turns the experience into structured practice. You choose a manageable step from your hierarchy, make a plan for how you'll respond to anxiety, stay in the situation long enough to use those tools, and then reflect afterward on what worked and what you want to remember next time. In that way, you're not just enduring anxiety, you're retraining your response to it. Many people find they can handle planned exposures when they know what to expect, but struggle when anxiety appears spontaneously. They'll say, "I forgot to use my skills," or "I was too anxious to think." In-Vivo coping exposures help address that gap. By repeatedly pairing the feared situation with deliberate coping responses, you are training your brain to access those skills more automatically. Over time, the coping becomes more natural. When unexpected anxiety arises, you're more likely to respond with tools rather than avoidance. There are situations where a general in-vivo exposure may be the best starting point. If your main goal is to build tolerance and reduce anxiety, simply staying in the situation and allowing the anxiety to settle can be very effective. Other situations call for a coping-focused approach. When you must engage actively during a flight, a meeting, a social interaction, or any circumstance where leaving isn't an option, having practiced coping strategies can make a significant difference. Often, the different exposure methods are not mutually exclusive. You might begin with imaginal coping exposures, then move into in-vivo coping exposures, and eventually find that general in-vivo exposures feel easier because your confidence has grown. As you continue to work with your hierarchy, you may find yourself moving between these approaches. One step on your hierarchy might involve simply being in a situation and allowing the anxiety to rise and fall. Another step might involve actively rehearsing coping tools while you're there. Both are valid. Both are effective. Both are ways of teaching your brain that anxiety is manageable and that avoidance is not required. What matters most is that the exposure remains gradual and structured. You're not jumping into the most difficult situations all at once. You're selecting steps that feel challenging but doable. You're repeating them until they become more tolerable. You're adjusting your plan as your anxiety levels change. And you're recognizing that success does not mean feeling completely calm. It means staying engaged, using your skills, and allowing yourself to learn from the experience. Take a moment now to consider how this applies to you. Take a look at the situations on your hierarchy. Would it be more helpful to simply stay and let the anxiety rise and fall? Or would it be helpful to practice specific coping strategies while you're in that situation? There is no single correct answer. The approach you choose depends on your goals, your needs, and the nature of the fear you're working with. It's important to be aware of your options. If you haven't listened to the other episodes on exposure therapy, this is a good time to do so. Also, be sure you have worked on developing your coping skills. A therapist experienced with these methods can help determine when you are ready. As we close this episode, let's take a moment to refocus. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently. Remind yourself that you don't have to take giant leaps. You only need to take the next step that feels possible. Take another slow breath and remind yourself. Each time you face a situation, whether you're practicing staying with the anxiety or practicing coping through it, you're teaching your brain something new. You're showing yourself that anxiety can be experienced, managed, and survived. You're building confidence not by eliminating fear, but by learning how to move forward with it. And every time you do that, you're sending a clear message to yourself. I can stay, I can cope, I can handle this. Until next time, keep practicing, keep breathing, and keep moving forward.